Community back with another video, and this one is going to be on diversity and actually how there are different effects on the trophic levels within an ecosystem. Now, first of all, we need to know what a trophic level is. A trophic level is a feeding step, and that's it shows a feeding relationship between organisms, and scientists often put it like this. The producers or the autotrophs are on one step. They're usually at the bottom. Then you go up, you have what's called the primary consumers. These are the ones that eat the plants, the autotrophs, usually herbivores, could be omnivores. And you have the third step here, which are the ones who eat these herbivores, usually a carnivore, omnivore. And then at the top, you have your tertiary consumer, the top of the food chain. And then, of course, decomposers. But trophic levels are steps, so we need to keep that in mind as we go through. All right, next we're going to talk about species diversity, and that's just simply the variety of the different kinds of organisms. Diversity has two components. It has the species richness, how many different kinds there are in the area, and then the relative abundance, how many there are in the area. So if you look over here, I have two communities. Community 1 has 4 different kinds of plants, A, B, C, and D. And community 2 has 4 different kinds of plants, A, B, C, and D. So their species richness is about the same. But if you look at the abundance, community 1 has 25, 25, 25, 25%. Community 2 has 80% A, 5% B, 5% C, and 10% D. So which forest would be considered the most diverse in an economic perspective? The one that would be considered the most diverse would be community 1, because you have not only the greatest variety or equal varieties in each, but you have equal abundance of each. Now, oftentimes in ecosystems and trophic levels, we have what's called invasive species. This is when species come in that do not belong in that range natively. The harm is, such as fire ants and kudzu are my examples down here. The harm is that when an animal that is not native to this area comes in, it's going to start affecting that trophic level system, because usually they do not have predators, so they have the ability to just kind of blossom or bloom or explode into a population that is uncontrollable. And this affects other trophic levels below and above them, and so it can throw off whole ecosystems. So invasive species are usually bad for the ecology. Now, within an ecosystem, there is usually species that have a very large impact. First, there's this dominant species, and this will be the species that's the most abundant. There's the highest biomass. The biomass is, if you add up all of the organisms together, how much weight they have compared to the population. They're usually the dominant species because they are competitively superior to other animals, and they're able to get the limited resources that other animals are not. And the removal of the species usually doesn't cause a problem, such as in New York we had chestnut trees that were the dominant species in the forest, and chestnut blight was brought over accidentally through a nursery, and it affected the forest from 1910 to 1950, and most of the chestnut trees were wiped out by this fungus, this chestnut blight. And economists haven't found anything that shows that the removal of this dominant species has an impact one way or another. They were simply replaced by other species that had been outcompeted by the chestnut. Now, the second type of species that has an impact would be a keystone species, and it does have a very large impact. Now, an example of it would be, they're not usually the most abundant species, but they're one that holds the whole ecosystem together. For example, Pisaster, which is starfish, in tide pools. If you remove all the starfish from the tide pool, the diversity of organisms in the tide pool greatly diminishes. So the starfish actually keeps under control. Starfish actually keeps under control the major competitors, and it makes sure that every species has a chance to survive. So if you remove it, the species diversity goes down. Another keystone species would be a sea otter. Now, sea otters feed on sea urchins, which feed on kelp forests, and where sea otters are abundant, The kelp forests are very rich and thick and everything, and the sea urchin population is kept down. But orcas over the last 20 years, killer whales, have been feeding on sea otters in certain areas, and as they feed on the sea otters, the sea urchin population has gone up because there's less predators of sea otters, and the kelp forests are almost disappearing in those areas. So, um, the keystone species have a dramatic impact on the other organisms around them, even though they're not necessarily the most abundant ones. The next thing is disturbances influence species diversity and composition. For many, many years, ecologists believed that communities were in equilibrium unless humans did something seriously to disturb it. It's called the balance of nature, which meant that interspecific competition, which we talked about last time, competition, predation, herbivory, were the key to diversity and composition. However, now we understand that there are all types of disturbances, such as storms, floods, forest fires, etc. But still, the strongest agent of disturbance today is still human activity, such as destroying lands by either agricultural development, logging, mining, or farming, etc. So we're still the biggest problem to diminishing diversity of these species. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is a thing called ecological succession. And when an area is colonized by a variety of species and then it's replaced by another species and then it's replaced by another species, that's what succession is. There are basically two types. There's primary and secondary. The first one, primary succession, is in the bottom left-hand corner down here. Primary succession usually starts on barren ground, and it begins with a thing called a lichen. A lichen is a pioneer species because it's the first one to ever come into an area. And basically the way I describe it is that the lichens are able to grow on this rocky, non-nutrient soil, and as they die, the lichens, which look kind of like a moss, they decompose them and put some nutrients there and create a thin layer of soil, so you have a little bit larger plants being able to come in and a little bit larger plants, etc., till eventually you're trying to reach what's called a climax community, which would be hardwood trees, or they're different from different environments. But primary succession starts at the very beginning. Some places have never reached their climax, their full potential at the end. The second type is secondary succession, and it's down here in the far right. And this is caused by disturbances that I mentioned on the last slide. Whenever an area has trees and things growing in it, and you have a forest fire, a hurricane, a flood, or something like that come in, it kills all the plants and everything that are there, but the plants do not have to start all the way back at the lichens because there's already soil. So it kind of starts in the middle, which they get small grasses and shrubs and trees and go up to trying to reach the climax community. But it starts over and over again. So these are the two types of ecological succession. They both take a very long time. They both are trying to reach the same ending point. But primary succession starts at the very beginning when there was no soil. Secondary succession starts after some type of disturbance. All right, I hope this helps you a little bit understand so many things that are affecting diversity of organisms within trophic levels. And I will talk to you very soon.